All right, so there was more opening statements from the prosecution in the Charles Merritt case. Again, he's charged with 4 counts of murder, accused of killing the entire McStay family, and the prosecution says this was about money. I want to bring on my guest right now, Charles Mittelstadt, defense criminal investigator. Charles, how are you, sir?
Good, Vincent. How are you?
I'm well, sir. I want to dive right into this. So we heard that word in that tape, was, and the prosecution says that Charles Merritt was referring to Joseph, his best friend, supposedly, in the past tense. Now, keep in mind, no one knew that the McStay family was dead at this point. They assumed they were in Mexico or just missing. But here we have Charles Merritt using the word was. What do you make of that?
Well, it's going to be one of the stronger parts of their case, right? This is an entirely circumstantial case. And so they're obviously going to go with the things, the evidence that they believe most points to Merritt being the prime suspect, the defendant in this case. And that certainly is one of them. I mean, that's something that the defense is going to have to deal with. And it's one of those issues, Vincent, where the jury is just going to have to decide whether that's something that happens under the stress of an interrogation or if it's truly meaningful in some way.
Right, and you and I have both done interrogations, and it could be the stress of the interrogation. Now, many people have said, listen, the prosecution has this huge uphill battle to prove this case, right, because we didn't see evidence inside the home initially. But they make a great point, and if you look at the timeline, especially on the day that Joseph and his family went missing, there were some phone calls between Joseph and Charles Merritt. There were some checks made just 2 days prior where someone, assumingly Charles Merritt, had logged into a QuickBooks account, made some checks, deposited some checks into Charles Merritt's account under the name Charles Merritt. So I think the prosecution's strongest point here is to say, yes, this was a financial motive. Charles owed this money. He couldn't pay it back, and therefore he killed the family. What say you?
Well, a lot of people owe money and they don't resort to committing murders in order to satisfy their debt. So, again, it's one of the strong parts of the prosecution's theory of their case. But the defense is going to point out that there's another individual by the name of Dan Kavanaugh who, it is my understanding, also availed himself of some of the funds in the company coffers in McStay's absence. So, and of course, we know that the defense is going to point to him as the prime suspect in this case. So, again, it's at the end of the day, it's how is the jury going to receive this evidence? Are they going to feel like that's sufficient to overcome the burden? Or is it just a financial dispute? Or is it just a property crime? Is it a theft and not necessarily a murder?
Right.
So we'll just have to see how that shakes out.
Absolutely. So much more to come. I'm glad you mentioned Daniel Kavanaugh. I want to talk about him later. We're going to take a quick break. Again, we're waiting for that courtroom to go live in California. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network. All right, so that was the defense opening statements. Now, Charles, the defense made some pretty good points here. Now, we have assumed, according to the prosecution, that the McStays were killed inside their home. But he talked about the clothing, which suggests they slept in the home the night of the 4th. There were eggs on the counter. We saw pictures of those eggs on the counter to suggest maybe someone was cooking breakfast there. And he talked about the drive that Charles Merritt would have had to have made from where he resides to the McStay home in California traffic during a certain time of the day. So the defense, I think, here is painting a reasonable doubt, if you will, in the jury's mind to say, hey, maybe Charles Merritt isn't the guy, not only based on what was in the home, the clothing, but the drive to get there at a certain time. What say you?
Those were some pretty compelling points that the defense attorney made. And it also demonstrates to me, Vincent, that they've done a very detailed analysis of the timeline. I mean, this was, I think, a very compelling attempt to sort of shift the prosecution's timeline. And, of course, they're also using as timestamps some of the phone records, and particularly Merritt's phone records, and if I recall, there was like a 3-hour gap there where there's no activity, and this seems to be this gap where they're alleging that this is when he would have committed the crime, right? And so it's very, very compelling, and I think later these phone records are going to be very significant, particularly with regard to the Victorville ping that where they're alleging that he was in Victorville. So what it tells me is, and I'm sort of getting, maybe a little ahead of us, but clearly his phone was not GPS enabled. Otherwise, they'd have specific data as to his whereabouts. So they're operating based upon cell tower mapping, and I'm hoping, based upon what we just saw from that opening argument and the amount of detail associated with it, that they're also going to be challenging some of the notions that the prosecution is going to make with regard to what we can extrapolate from that cell tower data, the reliability of the technology, azimuth issues with regard to directional issues of the location of the device itself, and so forth. So it's, this is a very, very interesting case, Vincent, where you have a lot of evidence that can be interpreted in one way or another, and it's really going to come down to who tells the more compelling story, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we heard the defense talk about this video of what the prosecution says was Charles Merritt's truck in the driveway. Let's take a look at that video right now.
Merritt's truck when he was in the custody of San Bernardino. I have markers on the right side showing the ground where the front headlight would hit at 33 inches. Okay, we're clear. And when you see that video, one thing you should watch out for is the headlight. What it have below it? Parking lights. Parking lights, you will hear, can never be turned off when the headlights are on. Tail lights, again, they cross at the 60-inch mark. Let's look at the Mitchie video. Same markers, same distance, the ground, the headlights, and the tail lights. So when the headlights go, they will hit at the 33-inch mark. The tail light should be out of camera range. If it's his vehicle, unfortunately, the tail lights are going the exact same 33-inch height. So, the first thing, it does not have the parking lights that Mr. Merritt's truck has. Second thing is the tail light is not up where it should be. Confirmation bias. See what you want to see and not the evidence. So if it's not his truck in the video, and then there's zero evidence that he drove down there on the 4th. They want you to convict on, well, we don't know where he was, but that's who we want.
All right, I want to make one correction. I said this was video from the driveway. That was actually video from a neighbor of the McStays of a truck passing by on February 4th. Now, Charles, the defense, I think, did a pretty good job here of not only looking at the video, but analyzing it as they matched up Charles Merritt's truck to the video on this truck. And another thing about that video that you can see there on your screen. Now, in my days of policing, I started to learn cars, headlights, and things of that nature. But in that video right there, it's really difficult to tell what kind of truck that is. And I think that's why maybe the defense went ahead and did their own analysis and got other video of Charles Merritt's truck.
Absolutely, Vincent. Of course, this is opening argument, right? So this is not evidence. They're going to actually have to support this. They're going to have to put up some sort of expert who's going to have to get this in. And let's see, how this withstands cross-examination in terms of the accuracy of their analysis. And but on its face, if it does hold, it seems to be pretty compelling, particularly with regard to the taillight aspect of it, because there is quite a differential between the headlight and the taillight height.
Right, absolutely, especially depending on the make and model of that vehicle. Again, we're waiting for the Charles Merritt trial to go live in California. He's accused of killing the entire McStay family, 4 individuals that went missing back in February of 2010. While we wait for that to go live, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to the Law and Crime Network. Welcome back, everyone. Again, we're covering the Charles Merritt murder. He's on trial right now for the murders of the McStay family, who went missing back in February of 2010. Prosecutors said he killed the entire family, a family of 4, and buried them in the desert. Initially, however, investigators believe the family had went to Mexico for whatever reason. But 3 years later, their bodies were found in 2 shallow graves. So now, let's hear testimony from a homicide detective, Troy DeGaulle, and talk about how he became involved in this case.
16. Did you receive a call from Susan Blake?
I did.
Okay. And did Miss Blake tell you that she had gone into the Avocado Vista residence?
She did.
And what did she say about that?
That she was in there cleaning up, and Michael had, I don't believe he was in there at the time of the phone call, but she said he had come in and he had taken the computer out of Joseph's office, and I believe MacGyver was with her, helping her clean up and straighten up.
And what did you do after you learned that information on the 16th?
Well, it was disheartening, but it wasn't her fault. So going back to, I'm going to explain from a homicide detective, at no time am I going to get in the family space and say, you can't, you won't. I'm actually asking them, give me everything you can. Tell me about your son. Tell me about Summer. Tell me about the grandkids. Give me everything. When you're dealing with a missing persons case and the family doesn't yet believe that their loved ones, and nor did I have to believe their loved ones were murdered, they're going to give you all the great stuff. My family's great, Summer's great, Joseph's great, the business is perfect, they're wealthy, the kids are a joy. That's what you get. And I know that, and that's fine. And sometime along that interview process over days, I'm going to try to wedge in there and say, I know they're fantastic people, tell me the bad things. Tell me who doesn't like them. Tell me who owes Joseph and Summer money. And that did evolve over time. It took some time. Kind of lost my train of thought. I don't have a family. I don't have anything that I know is a crime, except I now have a bunch of statements that are bending towards a family of 4 does not disappear for, on the 19th, 15 days. So where's a family of 4 after 15 days? And I have statements from the family saying, well, they might have gone on vacation. But now the family's starting to bend over and going, well, this is ridiculous. We're way too long. I have statements from business associates saying, well, we were rich and happy wasn't so true. So I'm going, well, that's unusual. I have family members telling me that Summer had an ex-boyfriend, that the story started to get, as I told you, it's going to get deeper. Some of the dirt's going to come up. The dirt was coming up. I wrote down everything I knew at that point. I took it to the judge. He granted me the search warrant. I searched the house, the trooper, the Dodge, and I left the house.
All right, so that was homicide detective Troy DeGaulle talking about his initial contact inside the McStay home. You heard testimony that Susan Blake told him she was in the home cleaning. Charles, I want to ask you this. Of course, initially this was not considered a crime scene, but you being an investigator yourself, what does that do to you when you hear someone say, hey, I'm in the home cleaning, and you don't know whether it's a crime scene or not?
Well, it's devastating, clearly, to the integrity of any potential crime scene. Let's not forget that this is a homicide investigator, and that we're not talking about a missing person case. We're talking about a missing persons case.
Right.
The fact that an entire family disappears without a trace, without leaving word to relatives, co-workers, friends, in and of itself ought to be substantially and significantly alarming enough to where that should send off enough alarm bells, in my opinion, to where this sort of process that the detective is describing, where it starts out nice and then we sort of get into the ugly stuff and the bad stuff and all that. you know, of course, it's easy for me to sit here, Vincent, and armchair quarterback this investigation, but this isn't some responding officer, patrol officer who's taking a report. We're talking about a homicide officer who is looking into this missing persons case.
Right. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So let's hear more of that testimony from Troy DeGaulle, again, the homicide detective in this case. All right, so that's more testimony from Troy DeGaulle, again, the homicide detective on this case. Charles, you and I were talking as this testimony was going on, and both of us as investigators have some issues here, no forced entry. You know, the amount of time it would have taken to clean this crime scene, and for Charles Merritt to have done this by himself and not leave too much DNA, or any DNA rather, at the crime scene. And we also were saying that the defense could argue that, yeah, Charles' DNA was inside the trooper because he worked for Joseph McStay. What say you?
This, Vincent, lends itself to the argument that the defense was making in opening that, in fact, the family was still alive on the 5th and up until the morning of the 5th. And it seems to me almost inconceivable that they could have been killed in their home. Even if you were a crime scene expert, I don't think you could ever adequately clean up the scene sufficiently to where there's no sort of trace evidence, biological evidence, etc. And the fact that there is none and they didn't even think it was a crime scene when they processed it is extremely compelling to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the problem both you and I are having here. Based on our experience of crime scenes, how do you clean that crime scene so well that when people walk into that home, they don't notice anything? And it appears like the family was cooking breakfast that morning.
In 3 hours and get back home.
Sorry, Charles. We have live testimony going on. We'll be right back and get you back in the courtroom in the Charles Merritt murder trial. Stay tuned. All right, still more testimony from Troy DeGaulle, again, the homicide detective in the Charles Merritt murder trial. Charles, Mittelstadt is still with me. I know, Charles, you have to go soon. I want to ask you a quick question here. You heard the defense. Of course, he's going to attack his experience, how long he's been a detective, how many homicides he's investigated. That's standard. But he did say something pretty interesting here. He said, as you enter this scene, you're thinking homicide because after the 10th day of a missing person, homicide is called out. But he also talked about not securing the home and things of that nature. What do you think about that, Charles?
Well, I think it's a very valid point. You and I had sort of discussed that a little bit earlier, and that's his job. He's supposed to go in there and lock down the evidence.
Right.
If it wasn't for that protocol, then what would the purpose be? There's a reason that protocol was developed, is because as time increases in missing persons cases, the likelihood of homicide being a potential cause of that is significantly increased, and so therefore his work becomes even more important.
Yeah, absolutely. Charles Mittelstadt, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I know you have to sign off. We are going to take a quick break and get right back into that courtroom in the Charles Merritt murder trial. Stay tuned to the Law&Crime Network.